new forms of trouble. I thought what I could do today, Celine's already mentioned my research focus, which is on quite sort of contemporary forms of political protest and in violence, terrorism, mostly in Europe. And I thought maybe what I could do today to start us off is that I'll share some of the ethical questions and dilemmas that I've come across in my own work. And I thought I also share some of the theoretical inspirations that I work with when it comes to working through and staying with that trouble, so to speak. And you'll see that that is feminist theory in my case, and particular branches of feminist theory. And yeah, it's theory that is very inspiring, but also very difficult because it actually doesn't really resolve any ethical dilemmas. So it really is about staying with the trouble. Of course, there is a lot of ethical dilemmas and questions, and there is a lot of interesting theories that we can draw on and work with. So I have absolutely no intention to give a talk that is representative of anything. It is just rather sharing some of my thoughts, and then, yeah, seeing that maybe as a beginning of a conversation where you all contribute, and where I'm very interested in hearing about your challenges and about the ways in which you cope or grow with your challenges. So I thought I have a few quotes. So what I might do is that I share my screen with you, and then I guess you just might have to change the presentation mode to actually see it big enough. But I'll make sure that I also read out the quotes so you can see it. So now I'm going to try and share my messy screen. Oh, host disable participant screen sharing. That's maybe one thing that you need to allow so that I can show my PowerPoint. If that's not an option, then I'll just read out the quotes. That's fine as well. Maybe we should have done the trial in the end. Shall I try again? No. Is that one thing that you could try to sort out, Maria? I guess you look as if you're already working on it. Yeah, I think staying with the trouble also means staying with all the technological difficulties, features of Zoom and things.
Ah, yes. I'm just trying to find you in
the big list of participants.
What I might just do for now is make you the host so that you have to share.
So everyone who disagrees with me might have to fear consequences. No? Okay, let's see whether I can try it now. Ah, you are the host now. Oh, that's suddenly a very different, slightly scary share screen. Share all windows. I was trying to just share a. Okay. Now. Play. Can you see my screen now? Great. Okay. That took a little longer than I expected, but my presentation is a bit shorter than 20 minutes anyway, so hopefully we should be fine with time. So as I said, I thought I'd share with you some quotes, some theoretical inspirations that I work with. And they are a branch of feminist theory that some people find very difficult. I find them difficult, but I also find them very inspiring. And one thinker in this context is Donna Haraway and her book, Staying with the Trouble. And I thought I'd start actually by sharing with you some of her acknowledgements because they are very interesting. I guess quite a few of you will be working on PhD theses or maybe on your first books. Some of you might have published them already, and I've definitely seen some participants who are well-established academics, obviously. And I just thought what I like about Donna Haraway's acknowledgements is that in a way, they show that even for the most established or celebrated scholars, acknowledgements and writing a book, that's a very messy process, and many people are involved. And I think, yeah, there's different ways of referring to it and talking about it in your acknowledgements. When I prepared this, I thought, well, actually, the acknowledgements in my PhD, in my first book, I think they mention 3 partners, all of whom had broken up by the end of me finishing the book. But I guess that's not how it has to be. And that's probably something I shouldn't say when we're recording this. So actually, let's turn to the trouble and how Donna Haraway defines that in this book. And that's a very long quote, so bear with me. She writes in the introduction, "Trouble is an interesting word. It derives from a 13th century French verb meaning to stir up, to make cloudy, to disturb. We, all of us on Terra," and that's a Harawayan term, obviously, "live in disturbing times, mixed up times, troubling and turbid times. The task is to become capable with each other in all of our bumptious kinds of response. Mixed up times are overflowing with both pain and joy, with vastly unjust patterns of pain and joy, with unnecessary killing of ongoingness, but also with necessary resurgence. The task is to make kin in lines of inventive connection as a practice of learning to live and die well with each other in a thick present. Our task is to make trouble, to stir up potent response to devastating events, as well as to settle troubled waters and rebuild quiet places. In urgent times, many of us are tempted to address trouble in terms of making an imagined future safe, of stopping something from happening that looms in the future, of clearing away the present and the past in order to make futures for coming generations. Staying with the trouble does not require such a relationship to times called the future. In fact, staying with the trouble requires learning to be truly present, not as a vanishing pivot between awful or Edenic pasts and apocalyptic or salvific futures, but as mortal critters entwined in myriad unfinished configurations of places, times, matters, meanings." So that's obviously very rich in and of itself and would deserve some untangling. But I thought I'd just add one other little bit where she talks in some more detail about staying in trouble, and then move on from there. So that's one other quote I wanted to share with you. Haraway says, "My multi-species storytelling is about recuperation and complex histories that are as full of dying as living, as full of endings, even genocides as beginnings. In the face of unrelenting, historically specific surplus suffering and companion species knottings, I'm not interested in reconciliation or restoration, but I'm deeply committed to the more modest possibilities of partial recuperation and getting on together. Call that staying with the trouble." I thought I'd add that last bit to it as well, because it sort of mentions really a key aspect of Haraway's methodology, which is what you can refer to as multi-species storytelling. And those of you who might have read some of Haraway's work know that it is really messy, and there's a lot of little insects and other creatures in her stories. And I think there are some problems with that, but it's also an incredibly powerful way of thinking about methodology, of talking about research, about political change. And in many ways, I guess we all are storytellers as researchers. And when we tell stories about protest, it's particularly interesting because they have a very strong political resonance. I don't know how relevant sort of material structures and non-human organisms are in your research. I guess traditionally they haven't really featured very prominently in research and political protest, but I think we can see a change here, and that's partly because there is a growing body of research on environmental activism, and in this context we sort of have to think about non-human elements, and also because there are obviously sort of recent developments in theory. So maybe this is not relevant to you at all, but maybe it is something that we could talk about in some more detail. I thought what I do now is really just to zoom in on, I think it's 4 questions that have been staying with me and that are trouble in many ways. And they are really important, I think, from an ethical point of view, and that we can't really necessarily resolve, but that might be questions that you think about as well. So we could then use these and maybe other questions as a beginning for our sort of debate. The first question, and now it'll be interesting in seeing whether the PowerPoint does the effects I wanted to. So the first question is, what are your politics of location? I don't know whether you're familiar with the term politics of location. Again, it is one that sort of is linked to a sort of feminist tradition of theory and philosophy. It was coined first by Adrienne Rich in the 1980s, and then adopted by Rosie Braidotti and other feminist scholars. And it's important to say, I guess, that location in this context is not just a place we choose to take as individuals. Braidotti would define it as a cartographies of power that rest on a critical genealogical self-narrative. That's now from nomadic subjects. So again, the narrative element is crucial here, but it's not a narrative that is entirely written and directed by us. It is necessarily relational and outside directed. And in this context, staying with the trouble also means that we think about the implications of the ways in which we are entangled in our in our topics and with people we work on or with and fight for and fight with or fight against. And Haraway in her earlier work had this notion of the God trick, which is quite useful to criticize the idea that we can see everything from nowhere. And there are still people who seem to believe that that's a possibility, even in the social sciences and in research and politics, where it's clearly deeply problematic to think that. And I guess feminist scholars have made a very important argument around being accountable of our own context, of our own background, of our own agenda, of the relationships that we have with the people we research, work with. And I think it can be very powerful and insightful to address that in our work. But at the same time, I'd be interested in the ways in which you address this ethical challenge, because I don't think there is an easy answer. It can be a very delicate balancing act, and there are contexts in which, for example, you might reveal something about yourself, about your background, about your relationship to the movement or the protest or the event that you're analyzing, and it can massively backfire because people won't take you seriously, or because there are other implications that are really unpleasant. And I think it is something that we need to consider, that we need to do, but we need to consider carefully how we present ourselves and our work depending on the context that we work in. So yeah, maybe that's something that we can discuss in some more detail later. Then the next question I thought I'd flag up, and that's a very obvious one that you all be thinking about, probably even more right now. How do you collect your data? That's a very ethical question as well, I think. It might be a difficult one for some of you if you are in a process of collecting data and you're actually now stopped from doing so by coronavirus. Some of you might have to change some of your methodologies. I certainly go through that at the moment, that I have to adapt the research plan because I obviously haven't factored a pandemic in. But I think even if you choose a mixed method approach, all of those come with their own challenges. And that's something that is interesting, how we address that at the neoliberal universities as institutions, because there are complex ethics procedures. I'm sure that many of you had to deal with them. And I think they can be productive, they can be useful, they can be really interesting feedback that we get from going through those ethics approvals. But at the same time, I think they are also primarily measures taken by universities to protect themselves in case that someone takes them to court or there are other problems. So they might not necessarily give us all the answers or all the feedback that we need. And I think one of the key questions when it comes to how do we collect our data is that of consent. And you will probably be familiar with the requirements of a university to obtain consent. And I guess from a feminist perspective, it is deeply problematic to think about consent as something that we get with a piece of paper. So to think of it as something that someone gives or that we can have, and that is just there, a bit like with agency or anything else, I think it needs to be thought as a process. And that leads to some problems, because if I say consent, for example, when it comes to interviews, is a process that doesn't finish with the interview, what are the implications of that? And I guess in my own work, the implications were that I kept on talking to participants. I shared the transcripts with them. I offered them the possibility to take things out of transcripts. But at the same time, I also found it important to reach a point in the research process where I didn't promise them that I'd change, for example, my analysis based on their views, because I saw that as a potential threat to my independence as a scholar. And it's very interesting how we negotiate those relationships and where we draw the line, if we want to draw a line. I think there's also really good arguments for not doing that at all, and for developing your analysis with your participants. So again, this is just something that I thought I mentioned and that we could discuss, because I'd be very interested in the ways in which you tackle questions like that when you work with data on protest. A third question that I thought I mentioned today, and that's already then, it's just one more after that. So the third question is, how do you account for silences? It's interesting how silence are always there. I mean, we had the awkward silence at the beginning of the Zoom meeting. It's just sort of part of our everyday experience, but it's interesting, the question of whether it's also part of our memory and how we work with it and relate to it in our research. And again, I guess my primary reference point there were sort of some feminist publications on this. There's an interesting book from 2013. It's called Silence, Feminism, Power, Reflections at the Edges of Sound, edited by Sheena Malhotra and Amy Carrillo-Rowe. And it's quite an interesting book because it tackles the sort of association of silence with powerlessness as a very Western concept. And they argue that silence should be seen as a possibility, as a space of possibility. And that doesn't mean that it's always a good thing. I think it is really important to acknowledge the political importance of speaking up, of fighting back, and that can be very subversive and empowering. At the same time, obviously, there are problems. For example, if we as researchers say that we speak for someone, or we enable them to speak, or if we actually don't see silence as something that can also be a choice and that can also be subversive. And that is interesting, because what silence looks like and how it manifests itself very much depends on the period you focus on and on the medium which you collect your data. So obviously it looks different when you work with oral history interviews and there's a lot of talking, and then there might be things that aren't set, or sometimes a moment of hesitation. That's very different from working, for example, with tweets and other social media content. Again, so there might be just things that are deleted, people that are blocked. But there might also just be people who don't use social media at all. And then it's an interesting question of, like, yeah, the politics of exclusion in this context. And that's a similar question, I think, when we work with historical data, because I worked in a lot of different small activist archives in Germany. And that enabled me to sort of access sources that wouldn't have been kept in the federal archives where I worked as well. And that's possible if you work on a period like I did since 1960s. And there's also still a lot of people who are alive and want to tell you their story, and sometimes actually interrupt your presentations to tell their story. But that's obviously very different if you focus on periods that are longer back. So again, it's interesting how archives are both spaces of collecting voices and narratives, but also always excluding accounts. So again, I think it's just something that I find interesting to explore a bit further when it comes to your own research. And then I thought of a last point that I wanted to touch upon there briefly is the question, how do you want to share your findings? And I think that too is an ethical question, but it's also a strategic question, to be honest. And that's one that, of course, you'll think about from many different angles. There are now today, I've seen faces and names of colleagues who are well established and who have published a lot. So they might not have this problem, I think, but when you are in the early stages of an academic career, you kind of have to be a bit strategic about it. And I guess most of us sort of want to or will be forced to publish in the form of academic journal articles and or books. And there is a real value in doing that, I think. But it's also important to acknowledge that this really limits the audience to a relatively small number of people who have access to these sources. So I guess, again, it's an interesting question how we deal with that as individuals. I guess what I try to do is I try to share my research generously and widely. I don't know actually how many feminist libraries and social centers I visited and how often I sort of slept in a squat on the floor while I was still fit enough to do that. But it's interesting as well, of course, because that is an uncomfortable space in many ways. I found when I was sharing my research with political activists, then quite often there was real interest and I think also, very positive responses. But there was also the clear criticism that I wasn't involved enough to write a history, for example, of militant feminist protest in Germany. And that they actually would like to see someone write that history who was more involved in the movement, who would write that history as an insider. So for them, I was too much of an outsider. And at the same time, I had academic audiences that sort of thought I'm too much of an insider, and I'm actually almost might be a feminist terrorist myself. And it's really interesting how then you notice that obviously sharing your research in different contexts, you will get very different responses. And I guess also getting that sort of critical and uncomfortable feedback sometimes can be very productive. So I think it's definitely worth staying with the trouble. I guess that's probably all that I thought I start us off with. And I'd just be really interested in hearing more about your work. Yeah.
All right, thank you very much, Kata. So now the floor is open to anyone to ask question in the chat group. So I'm gonna give you a few minutes just to write down your questions. But in the meantime, maybe I might ask you a question and take this opportunity. I was actually really interested with your comments about archives being both a place where we are collecting voices, but also a place where you are excluding some of them. And I was wondering if you could maybe develop a bit on this from your own experience of how, especially working on historical sources, how can you actually find voices that have been potentially silenced or excluded in the past?
Thank you, Celine. I guess that's a difficult question. It's definitely an easier question when you're working on contemporary politics, because I think there's always the possibility to find people and then talk to them. So that was a really big part of my research, to actually identify individuals and groups and then approach them. And they were not necessarily very interested in talking to me sometimes. So it was a long and a painful process. And again, it is about trust and about having a relationship with people. And then they might be willing to talk to you. But ironically, sometimes I found that I couldn't challenge silences because these people were not willing to talk. In a recorded interview, I was not allowed to record it. I was not, and actually I also decided sometimes not to use the material because I couldn't guarantee that it wouldn't incriminate someone, or it could lead to quite difficult, quite difficult consequences for the people I spoke to and for other people. And I think in archives, there are interesting aspects. On the one hand, for example, in the archives I worked in, the federal archives, for example, there are some very strict rules around the files that you're allowed to access and the files that you're not allowed to access. So a lot of stuff that I would find interesting because it is about terrorism, about political violence, would still be closed. Then I think an interesting route is to work with other files and see who's mentioned in those files. And sometimes there would be very rich contexts that I could sort of get through working with these other files. So in a way, then by working, it's a bit like a patchwork. You work around the gap and then suddenly it takes shape and you might be able to somehow try and tackle it. So that was an important part. And then I think really trying to approach people, and you might, everyone who works on contemporary protest might find that sometimes you are lucky enough to sort of meet someone who's might be referred to as a gatekeeper, who actually knows a lot of other people. And then people who would usually not be very keen to talk might actually end up talking to you because they know this person really well, who now then knows you well and actually trusts you. And because they trust you, this trust sort of extends to someone else who would otherwise not speak at all. But I think, yeah, it is also important to just acknowledge that there are silences and that we can't tackle them. I think that might be much more difficult for people who work on protests that is further back in history, because it is very difficult to sort of get those testimonies retrospectively.
Right, thank you. So we have got now a question from Maria, asking if you could say something on the relationship between openness, entanglements, and uncertainty of a troublesome research process and the finality of research outputs, which potentially force you to reduce this complexity and halt all that movement. So how can you address this tension?
Wow, let me read that. Okay.
Might be easier to read it.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah. So I think entanglement is probably the one I would start with, because that's I think a really important one. And I think by engaging with topics and by working, especially if you work on people and their political significance, we almost necessarily get entangled in complex ways. And that means with individuals, with whole movements, with topics. And actually it's almost impossible to disentangle that. One example that I sometimes use when I talk to students about the importance of this is that I use, for example, you could say, well, if I interview someone being who I am, who's been involved in sort of militant feminist activism, that's a very different experience from interviewing someone who was involved in far-right violence in Germany. And that's both something that I work on, but my relationship to it and the responses that I have are very different. And I guess a first step for me is to then be as open as possible with myself and with the people with who I feel safe and I can share this and explore these entanglements. And then a second step is to acknowledge the uncertainty and the difficulty of the research process and think carefully how I relate to these questions in my publications, for example. I think that every academic discipline, and that's interesting today that we are also scholars based in different countries. There's also different cultures when it comes to how we write academically, of course. If we compare even like France, Germany and the United Kingdom, there are huge differences there. So I would say there is a real need to be strategic when it comes to research outputs. That might sound a bit sad, but I guess it is just the time we live in. And I know a lot of brilliant people who have really struggled to publish things, and that's not because of the research they do, because that's incredibly exciting, but just because people pick up little things, for example, about the ways in which they position themselves in their research, and then they won't bother reading any further, and that's a really sad reason to have an article rejected. So I think, yeah, being strategic about it, discussing it with your peers and discussing it with other people is great. And then you can still write a blog where you share all the rest, if that's something that you want to share. But again, that is just probably my experience, and other people might have very different experiences. Don't know whether that is a response to that super complex question.
Yeah, I think so. Thank you, Kata. So I'm going to move on to another question. So we've got one from Dave, which is a bit long. So I'm going to try to sum it up, and I hope I don't interpret your question, Dave. But it's basically about, so Dave was quite interested about your point about maintaining the separation between personal politics or activism and your own research. Mm-hmm. And so, well, maybe we can discuss it more later during the roundtable with all our participants, but perhaps you could say a bit more about how you have dealt with that and how perhaps your own personal politics or activism or background has basically impacted your own work, and how you, the ways you found to maintain some kind of impartiality, I guess.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting that you asked this, Dave. And I do think the dynamics are quite different when you work on historical cases where you actually work primarily or exclusively with archival findings, because I guess there's also a real attraction, maybe that sounds weird now, but I think there's a real attraction to old texts and paper and how it smells, and engaging with these sources, and they might have a strong emotional impact on us as well. But I guess it is a different impact from talking to a person who will ask questions back, who will challenge you in ways that might be uncomfortable, or try to bond with you in ways that are interesting. And that's probably something that affects us all. So I think what I find helpful where possible is to draw on very different sources, resources and accounts when I research something, which is certainly something that I have done. But at the same time, I've never really actively distanced myself from my interview subjects, from the protest movement that I've worked on, because I don't think I would be where I am today, obviously, without feminism, because there would be no women at university still, probably, and there would be it would be not possible for a woman with a child to work and be a mother. So I think I sort of already, my very existence is very much based on some of those political protests that form the basis of what I analyze. At the same time, that doesn't mean that I agree with everything, or that I shouldn't be critical of my own position or of the positions of the people I work with and work on. And I think that is where I think you're right. We do need a sort of critical distance, but I think actually that critical distance emerges from an honest exploration of our entanglements, rather than from the attempt of playing that God trick that is to try to pretend that we see everything from nowhere and that we actually don't have an impact on the things and the people we work with, and they don't have an impact on us. I think that is necessarily the case. And I guess when it comes to history, that goes back further, like what you work on, there's always this interesting question as well, like what attracts you to what you're working on? What attracts you to that particular topic? Why do you deal with it? Like your life could be so much easier without it. I'm not encouraging obviously to leave academia. I'm sure it's great what you do, but that's another interesting question. Why do we feel appalled or attracted to certain things? What do they do to us? And I think there are some people who work on topics primarily or exclusively because they want to fill a research gap. Most of us, especially at the stage that we're all at, need to be driven by passion. And so that's another thing that is worth exploring. But as I said, I think it is important to be strategic about this. I think one thing that I've done over the years, for example, is, this might sound very silly again, but I just went back to my original hair color, which is something that I wanted to do anyway. I don't know whether, Nick, you've ever met me with very red hair, but I did have very red hair. And since one of the feminist groups I worked on was also called the Red Zora, and was always had a girl with very red hair, it kind of was a bit too close to my research and kind of then pulled me in a way that almost, took my agency away to speak as who I am. So it's very funny how sometimes that haunts us and how that gets us in moments when we don't expect it. So I guess that's one of the challenges of working on the topics that I work on.
Right, thanks, Kata. I hope that answers your question, Dave. I think we can take another question, maybe because we started a bit late. So maybe building on this, I'm going to take the question from Katharina, who was asking again about your relationship with your own activist background and the access to kind of official sources and archives. She was wondering if you find yourself avoiding certain phrases or formulations when you're describing your research in order to avoid assumptions being made about your own politic or your own background that might prevent you from accessing the data you're looking for.
Yeah, thanks, Katharina. That's also someone I know a bit. That's a very interesting question. I think in the German context, for example, it is a loaded question, the question of terminology. And you're all familiar with the term that one person's terrorist is another person's freedom fighter. It's so when we talk about political violence and sort of terrorism, it's a very charged territory. And that's definitely something that you notice when you go to archives. I remember that I went to one archive where someone said to me, literally, 5 or 10 years ago, someone like you wouldn't have had access to this archive. And I think that is because they saw it as a resource for sort of very openly, subversively working activists. And because when you say, I'm writing a history of left-wing terrorism in the Federal Republic, then they say, well, that's not how we call that. For us, that was an armed struggle against an oppressive state. And that is an important thing to acknowledge. So I think there are interesting questions around how you describe your research. And I think it can be really helpful to think about that openly. But at the same time, of course, I think it's important to be, especially if you want to work in these archives again, it's important to be honest and to not try to sort of change the language on this occasion and still publish a book that uses all the terms that they don't want to say. And without sort of actually telling them why he used that terminology. I think when it comes to the federal archives and a lot of other official state archives, I'm sure you also have to use the right terms. And that is already how these archives operate, that you actually work within their systems, within their play according to their rules. And so there are always politics when it comes to archives. And I think the more aware we are of those politics, the better, really. And even when you say, okay, here's one feminist archive and there's another feminist archive, chances are that the people who set it up actually fell out with each other and totally disagree. So even then, sometimes saying, and yeah, and I was in this other archive, can create a strong response in someone. So I've learned to try to just be as diplomatic as possible while being as honest as I think I have to be. Don't know whether that's an answer.
I guess so. It sounds like an answer to me. Thanks, Kata. So I'm thinking, because we are starting to be a bit late on in terms of time, so I think we might actually go for the break now. I'm aware there's still a few questions remaining, but perhaps we can just address them during the roundtable later today, or even maybe tomorrow, hopefully. Everybody will get their answers at some point. So thank you again so much, Katharina, for being here and for your keynote today and for answering all these questions. And so let's take a break of, shall we do 15 minutes